can save the cards and I'll highlight.
Alright. I'll just toss it in the front folder.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. Thank you. Design house and how to do that. Anybody have any questions quickly before we start?
Okay. Thanks. Okay. It's sent. I got it. Cool. Everyone's good then? Yeah. Okay.
The advantages of appropriation, current copyright law is protecting his creative works, perpetuating a violent history of cultural dispossession. Read 21 copyright includes product songs as method requirement of being writing or fixing his works and not being recorded but collect memory culture in the public domain. Appropriated beneath with the burden of a large amount of cultural materials eligible for protection, borrowing culture for education purposes common in its community. Some other appropriations offensive when authorized use fall within copyright fair use exemption. Reproduction as an exotic commodity pragmatic for appropriation, the causing significant harm through dispossession. Appropriation of culture represents the ongoing dispossession of indigenous sovereignty and self-determination by the settler state. This cultural modification compounds psychological, political, and violent harms upon its communities. Read 21. The culture remains sovereignty, popular culture protected its creativity, divesting autonomy, self-determination, actively dispossessing its culture, excluded but culture while getting public domain, the unauthorized taking, informed conquest, legitimizing new settler state, appropriation without free, prior informed consent is continuation of colonialism, compound psychological, political harms, failure, risk, inflicting harms on generations, humiliation, violence, and discrimination, diminished sovereignty, safeguarding memory, gender, authority, and cultural sovereignty, unless it is people control production, possibility for sovereignty, is bleak, conservation of sovereignty into settler property is conquest. Fair use currently uses 3 factors to determine fair use, how transformed to commercial exploitation and market value. The second factor on nature of a work is left out. Read 21. Is people should rely on copyright fair use, permits unauthorized use when public interest outweighs holder's interest. Holder has the right to prevent others from reproducing. Right is limited course focused on whether the work is transformative, commercial, not profit, addresses economic value. Amount used little attention to nature of work itself. Culture works play a significant role in determining appropriation. The work being copied, key types of inquiry for adjudicating justiness. The appropriation for the relations of production, inquiring setting form, and intellectual value is integral to nature inquiry. The second factor has been reduced to 2 distinctions: whether work was published and whether it was factual. Neither have any relevance. Read 21. Neither distinction shed any light on the second fair use factor. Supreme Court recognized 2 distinctions: whether work was published, whether work is created or factual. Whether the material is created or factual survived much longer. The court refined the factual nature assessment. Its expressed nature was of little consequence. The second factor increases reliance on the other factors, but it's little to inform what aspects of nature. Foreclose unauthorized uses. Courts reduce consideration to a binary question of whether appropriate work is created or factual. Courts simply dismiss the second factor. It is so vague, court cannot apply it. It's wholly inadequate for adjudicating cultural appropriation. Read 21. As groups assert their rights to creativity, the current test will be of little benefit to decide the complex cultural appropriations. Religious Technology Center, the district court struggled to identify the nature of the church documents, reach opposite conclusions. Spiritual works are left in appropriation limbo. Judge trafficking proximity copyright core. Ambivalence raises doubts that the current analysis could weigh specific harms appropriation causes against public interest. Centering the second fair use factor to examine the ontological nature of a work and impact of appropriation on a created environment and views a work within its network of relations and rejects vague taxonomies that prevents unauthorized appropriation. Read 21. Second factor should protect authorship Examine creative environment to understand the expectations and lives on unauthorized use, impact, incentives, way against fair use. The requiring appropriate consult communities to determine that work from a individual's point of view, take precautions to ensure interests are protected, comply with individual communities. Core assess whether unauthorized use will disrupt motivation, framing nature as ontological, examine the context. Taxonomy approach, privilege, European settler culture. Ontological approach, examine relations. Google versus Oracle, indicate movement towards such an approach, observing how work is generated, functions, and valued. Should be privilege over appropriation, allows us to see how work is valued. Copyright is key, fair use must be amended to accommodate culture without falsely excluding indigenous products is incomprehensible. To legal frameworks, read 21. Current fair use be of little benefit judges. Works are left in limbo, structure based on proximity, genres that are factual. Second fair use factor has been written out. The rehabilitative fair use that accomplishes settler colonial appropriation, rehabilitation gives nature its meaning. And it is works fit within copyright fair use to fail within account diversity. Copyright must revolve. Concerns for applicability are overblown and easily overcome. Fuentes 03. Originality is not the most valued in any art, but rather faithful reproduction. Original means only the work was independently creative and it possesses creativity. Folklore is sufficient to pass the threshold. Works lack tangible fixation. To be benefit, start date impossible to be set. Term does not begin. Copyright laws are flexible to accord for such status. To indigenous artwork, fixation excused by proof of authorship. The copyright most appropriate system, harmonization of international recognition and inarguable, provide appropriate remedies against international infringement, improve protection enforced within national boundaries instead of limited confines, establishing ownership, decided who represents the rights, indigenous people, governments, private entity could be responsible. Indigenous people want access to copyright, engaging in structures that have previously disadvantaged them, allows protection and cultural survival. Farley 97, theft of cultural symbols represents a vital blow of civilization. Art is fundamental to cultural identity. Those who strip away its meanings, each time heritage has little with these people. Indigenous groups sought legal redress. Groups are willing to participate in Western IPR where women feel excluded. They authorize certain uses, license, and collect royalties. They want copyright to take back their culture. Some use IP to prevent cultural harm. Expropriation will cause imagery to lose external significance, then lead to dissolution of culture. Control over cultural practices and intellectual property is a necessity in a world where Western understandings dominate and co-opt indigenous culture under the guise of globalization. Smith zero expansion signals 400 years of change colonization without any boundaries that shape understandings collapsing. Western understandings attitude to become dominant, increasing commodification of culture. Globalization means of opening up markets, provide access to cultural practices. The object is not only indigenous IP, but the future of indigenous societies. Oracle does not have the app, but it dumps every disset link. That's 321. Google versus Oracle because the code does not intend to be innovative. The core found did not merit protection. The core fell back on factual creative distinction. Previously established, every act of appropriation is one step closer to the extinction of indigenous heritage. Kuruk 99. Commercialization sought to take into account culture and intellectual property law has been the leading area to protect indigenous people. Commercialization, indigenous societies find themselves examined as ever before. Cultural heritage is the original assault. Each time that happens, heritage that the people. The most urgent is to preserve cultural knowledge to maintain their vitality. Thus, the plan of the United States federal government should strengthen its protection of copyright by using the second fair use factor to examine the ontological nature of work and potential impact of unauthorized appropriation on the creative environment. Frame. Existential risk analysis is statistically impossible and justifies genocide. To serve with 21 low probability plus extinction is alternative probabilistic analysis. Crux is also failure by mismatch between method and object study and then calculating would be trying to estimate something that can only happen once without any evidence to prevent it from happening. We should not spend too little time to prevent something we don't know is possible. Lean towards skepticism. The reducing risk by 1 billionth of 1 billionth to 1 percentage point is worth 100 billion more lives than genocide. 1 billion people implied utilitarian calculus stretches the limits of any known means of deciding how we should act. Vast numbers gives the idea that extinction is worth more than any justice. Small sample size biases. Unreliability means that one should not read too much into expert surveys. Problem is when it's treated as scientific for policy, the field's model received considerable funding from tech billionaires. The complete with disciplines about essentially crushing oppression. Existential risk analysis is not risk analysis founded on possible data point. It offers promissory rhetoric of probability rather than rigorous calculation to evaluate humans quantitatively incapable of extricating itself from eugenics. The numerical possibilities of possibility with the baked assumption of plausibility. Utilitarianism justifies exploitation of indigenous communities for Western gain. Rejected. Smith 87. Genocidal consequences precede conscious decision to destroy indigenous people, push for extinction. The utilitarian genocide become prominent in the Americas became pronounced and people subject to genocide attacks in the name of development. Some persons must die so that others can live. That's be total. Extinction is an empty superlative. Forego improbable impacts and retrench humanity into Western frames that manifest colonial genocide. Mitchell 17. Extinction become an empty superlative. Gestures to abstract unthinkability. Exposure contributes to formation of Western subjects. Extinction fantasy negation. Expresses destruction desires. Extinction is not metaphor. White dominant discourses addresses systemic destruction, enacting moves to innocence and bad culpability, and perpetuate violence disproportionately affect groups inflicted to create space for aggressors. Aspect of colonial genocides. Treating extinction as something short retrenches Eurocentric understandings of personhood, which is an act of violence, obscures entwinement with racializing structures, prioritize structural violence as a prerequisite to addressing other modes of destruction. Mitchell 17. Structural violence involves systemic discrimination, colonialism, and complexes with violence. Each of these forms is devastating. Significant cause of extinction, identify climate change, driver extinction, dissolution of governance, destruction of knowledge through appropriation, colonial genocide, embody all destruction by killing indigenous communities, and erasing knowledge responses leave violence attack and make out to their power. Focus on extreme calamity, obscures dispossesses of logics that precipitate extinction events. Tushar what's 21. Extreme calamity ignores the violence on groups of people which existential conditions at stake. Humans can intentionally commit such acts, indicates nothing, prevents utterly destroying each other. Genocides participate existential threats, those who participate them, perpetuate them, seem to remake the human condition. Studies downplay genocide and internet suffering. The unprecedented current moment is on distancing from past violence, relies on distancing from past violence, and just people see themselves as navigating long-standing crisis. The technologies that will save us run on resources from communities treated as expendable. What if scenarios harder to prioritize urgent calamities? IP is repurposed towards indigenous knowledge protections. Anything else denies them a valuable legal tool against appropriation carpenter for indigenous peoples' rights to ownership of specific properties. It is true that Western concepts of creation and ownership, but those laws are the primary vehicle for protection for works that segregate indigenous interests from this regime. In light of globalization and commodification, to design a powerful legal shield and a powerful sword, it is essential that laws are not discarded but adapted to accommodate indigenous situations. The inclusion of cultural knowledge works within the intellectual property regime requires some rewiring but does not diminish the value of the machine itself. Copyright laws in the current formulation are inadequate. Copyright laws must be expanded to protect cultures.
Are you good?
Yeah.
Okay, I want to start on the plan. How does the federal government determine the impact of ontological works or the unauthorized appropriation on the creative environment?
How they do in the status quo. For example, they look at how in the Google v. Oracle case, they looked at how the copied code affected the software environment. These
they
are
look at
procedures
copied
that they already
code.
have.
Yeah,
in
I'm
the
talking about
status quo.
indigenous creative works, not code.
Yeah,
Or,
for
other
example,
works.
the read evidence indicates that normal means would, just like in the status quo, would be bringing the stakeholders of the fair use case to the table so they can describe the effect of appropriation.
Hold on. So the plan brings indigenous people to discuss what they determine to be.
Well, that is not a
creative
mandate of the plan. That is simply how fair use court cases
It's
work.
not
now.
a mandate of the plan. So what does the plan mandate as per how the government determines what is fair use?
It mandates that the government has to consider how a work functions in its environment
How a
after
work
appropriation.
functions. Yeah, my
That's the
question is-
ontological nature, and then the effect on its creative environment would be how the appropriation.
Okay, so what are the factors that go into how a work functions, or what does the government use to determine whether a work is, I guess, affecting its creative environment?
Again, they bring stakeholders to
Okay,
the
so the
table.
only internal link that you say you do not mandate is that you bring indigenous people.
No,
to the
it's
table.
not. It's not literally a mandate of the plan because that is how fair use court law works. When they determine how to weigh fair use, they bring the people who have brought the case to the court. They ask them how
when
has this
suits
impacted
occur,
your market
maybe.
value.
When suits occur, maybe, but in the actual passage of the plan, what is the standard for lower courts to address what is unauthorized use?
Unauthorized use literally just means you copied someone's work without their permission. That's just infringement.
Yeah, but the act changes the standard for what is fair use under that standard.
Yeah, because it says it expands the second factor of fair use, which is used to consider whether fair use is allowed, and it says that instead of just considering a factual creative distinction, you have to consider how a work, how appropriation has affected the environment.
On framing, what standard does the act use for assessing risk?
For example, we think we should forego improbable
Okay,
impacts
no.
extinction.
That's kind of my problem with the whole framing part. You said don't evaluate existential risk and prioritize structural violence.
Yeah.
How do you weigh certain structural violences, certain other impacts against each other?
Well, first, the framing page is literally framing, as in you should look at structural violence first, and you should correct for endemic biases.
Okay, so if there's a super highly
But
probable
second, I guess
existential risk.
if you were trying to weigh this, we would say you'd have to calculate and multiply the internal links of each.
So you multiply the internal links of each scenario. Okay. Let me see 1 second.
You want this? No.
It's 5 off then. Case and frame.
First half is T on unauthorized use. Protection of IPR requires safeguarding of creations against unauthorized use. Shafiri 24. Discord IP protection refers to legal mechanisms that allow creators to safeguard creations from unauthorized use or exploitation. This spans forms of IP, including patents, trademarks, or copyrights. Violation of fair use is authorized use of copyright. Vote nay. 1. Limits the enter below the lid of the topic by including any app that changes the way authorized use of IP is governed, from licensing terms to financial incentives for rights holders to contract with third parties. There's a whole different IP topic, and neg prep is already unmanageable. 2 is ground. They're interrupts bidirectional. They can pay the license fees for any patent to encourage texturing, which makes patents bad. Part of affirmative ground, and links to the most stable offense like court clog, agency trade-off. DS assumed expanded enforcement against infringement. Next off is sui generis counterpoint. The United States federal government should create a sui generis regime to determine indigenous creative works from unauthorized use, examining the ontological nature of works and their impact on the environment. Russell will send out the correct counterplan text. The counterplan creates a bespoke legal category with identical protection and avoids uncertainty that zaps the case. Gazebo 24. Certain subject matter cannot be protected by existing IP regimes. The regimes need to balance the public's access to primary interest protection by a combination of standard regimes can make it difficult to determine rights. To resolve this, some suggest that courts choose the right they want, although courts might not object to overlap. It's not clear what extent a particular right should be enforced. Sui generis rights grant social legal protection rights emanate from an ability to stretch existing IPRs to new things through sui generis rights. Mix of copyright, patent, or trademark principles would not be merely derivative of the standard IP. Sui generis laws ameliorate defects, preventing free riding, encourage innovation, and improve the legal environment. The app overstretches conventional IPRs. Sui generis solves splinters. 7. Sui generis IP to avoid problems of extending protection have enacted. The first protection of certain IP, SCPA protects semiconductors. The VHDPA protected whole designs to adapt current law would adversely affect other IP. Uncertainty for new tech aids dissuades innovation. Patents of dubious validity restrict inventions. Copying is damaging. However, drastically changing traditional copyright or patent does not promote optimum innovation. Uncertain, vague, and inconsistent tests, and unfair and harmful patch law would likely result in debate and add significant complexity. New law should take the place of general protection with new rules of patent and copyright would be harmonious with their foundations. The next office is the delegation counterpoint. The United States. Russell will send out this text as well. The United States federal government should endow indigenous peoples with full jurisdiction over their land, property, and status. Establish that the United States federal government forswears and lacks jurisdiction over indigenous creative works, and adopt indigenous standards for protection over creative works. Only the counterplan solves case. Rather than having the government mandate copyright reform, the United States should fully transfer its jurisdiction. That confers absolute and genuine independence, allowing indigenous people to then choose to amend fair use and leaving them immune from federal interference. Reeves 22. Indigenous people have sovereignty yet not to protect their lands and resources. One harm is pipeline such perpetuous colonization in order for communities to protect themselves. It's crucial that the U.S. and acknowledge native land and fully recognize sovereignty. Well, it's too late to change history. It's not to change the future. U.S. can effectuate sovereignty to right its historic wrongs against indigenous people. Sovereignty is the highest authority. This includes the right to their own legislation. Yet in the U.S., tribes are stripped of the decision-making when interests over native land clash with the U.S. The courts have refused to consistently uphold sovereignty, elevating states' interest above tribes. If courts do not affirm sovereignty, people will be subject to the same abuses they've suffered throughout history. This makes it more difficult to hold the U.S. accountable for harms they'll inflict on native land. The net benefit is tribal sovereignty. This is what their author actually advocates. Read 21. Indigenous sovereigns not colonizing government should exercise control over creative expressions. Imposing Copyright Act on tribal lands would impermissibly invade sovereignty. To remedy, the U.S. should enter into bilateral agreements with each tribe, establishing mutually agreed upon protections for creative expressions. This is how the U.S. has historically engaged in the negotiations with tribes. Such agreements would avoid intrusion on tribal sovereignty while providing reciprocal federal recognition and enforcement of indigenous IP. Such agreements already pervade indigenous federal relations, treaties, government-to-government agreements, SCA. These allow tribal self-determination. The result will be a robust IP framework that protects indigenous interests while upholding sovereign tribal nations. Court curbing counterpoint. The United States Congress should unanimously pass a resolution threatening the judiciary if it does not require strengthening its protection of copyright by using the second fair use factor to examine the ontological nature of work and potential impact of unauthorized appropriation on its creative environment. Curbing threats, ensure compliance, and deter strike down of Biden's agenda. Block 20. After Roosevelt proposal, the court stopped overturning programs. The court has proved susceptible to the pressure in no instance did Congress truly enact laws in each court changed anyway. Historically, court gets the message of binding have to contend 6 conservative proposals occur, but the fear of God in judges. The Roberts ACA vote was institutional. Roberts take threats seriously. Unrestrained conservative majority destroys the admin state. Coffee. 22. Court's conservative wing moving at a rapid pace to dismantle the admin state. Court has taken significant steps at a fast pace. Much depends on swing vote of Roberts, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. The president is challenged, and vulnerable agencies may soon have very confined discretion that does not allow them to address the most significant environment issues, climate change, pandemic, and the economy. Admin state prevents extinction. Clear. 21. We live in a vulnerable world. Disease, weak financial systems, accidents, attacks on systems, climate vulnerability of systems on which life depends. A signal mutation away from causing a deadly pandemic. Administrative devices that mitigate vulnerability. Laid out strategy preparedness. Disasters, blackouts, or terrorist attacks. They drew on expert coordination planning across agency systems that are required to sustain life from nuclear attack. Administrative readiness. A vast range of functions. Welfare, econ, and industrial power says. Admin states. The next stops to spill over to you. Copyright reform creates a slippery slope that disrupts existing legal doctrines that creates a choke point for future innovation. Trust Wiki 24. Copyright when lies between become blurry and applying a entirely different way. Judges faced with new use of IP that did not fit within statutory law find themselves in a position where decision likely affect new invention with added complexity. Due blurred vision text become texting in the U.S. case law, enshrining the Constitution. Courts have used incentive as basis for refusing ultimate goal will be served better by deeming derivative use public good. This approach bears in for found internal binary opposition between incentives for creativity and use, excessive production result in stifling new works as those are always derivative with earlier creation. The U.S. becomes a to be or not to be for innovation, a choke point created by inflexible legislation, specifically carves away a categorical bright line that so far enabled tech innovation and shielded search engines from liability, despite them helping people access copyrighted works. That ends the internet. Week 23. Concerns about restricting content on the internet if against Google and Amazon by focusing on fairness reduction courts to resolve both that promotes objectives considering potential ramifications of the internet. Court faced lawsuits against alleging Google was liable for contributing infringement without search engine tools is nearly unnavigable by announcing Bright Line Rule 9 Circuit. Created an environment when service providers couldn't continue to operate without fear for 15 years. The businesses have operated under the rule without fear of infringing. This clarity of expectation helped the internet expand massive info aggregating in favor of a different standard, create confusion and risk and very different on the internet. Extinction, Maryland 21. Internet is globalized, can destroy us. The internet is in danger. Our species can go down with the ship. If the internet were destabilized, collapse would follow. The internet will determine the fate of our species. We cannot approach climate change without internet, let alone the trade, aging infrastructure, multipolar states, produce recipe for new disaster, estimates for internet and global meltdowns, cause the system to disintegrate in unpredictable ways. Case. 1. Their author concludes that applying copyright law to native works wrecks tribal sovereignty. Read 21. States will apply copyright on tribal lands may require for tribes of cultural creative that help maintain tribal lands and applying copyright and disrupt tribal sovereignty and cause substantial harm to tribal economies. Read also says that native law should supersede federal law. Read 21. While where tribal intellectual property occupy the same field as copyright, tribal entitlement, not federal law should govern creativity occurring on tribal lands. The imposition of copyright impermissibly evades tribal sovereignty. Read also concludes that copyright law can't solve cultural appropriation. Read 21. Copyright and the PCF for tribal creators of copyright control will be traditional creativity. It might hamper the way ceremonial practitioners create and perform their work, help people recognize its potential for harm. Framing. 1. Default to a utility. 23. Anyone agrees suffering is about well-being is an arbitrary limit moral concern is usually wrong to steal, but most are open to reach taxation allows benefits that raise well-being. Utilitarians default starting point. They're realizing if something benefits personally. These can convince ourselves that it must be okay to correct biases, fortune partially imagining by ignorance if you're likely to end up being anyone prudent, maximize overall well-being, equal weight. When outcomes are uncertain, we discuss weighted probabilities better. When it offers greater expectation, expanding moral circle past moral atrocities, perpetuates exclude victims. Better rejection making us error expand our moral concern include all no competing views, superior giving. Now terrible killing. We should be not want less as the ontologists might claim. Avoid moral constraints of awfully narcissistic, maintain moral impunity or clean hands and partial observers. Help this outcome deontological institution result from emotional bias favoring those like ourselves. Justification, evolution, blind judgments, unreliable, inconsistent emotional responses. Favoritism.
Okay. You good?
Yep.
Status?
Conditional.
You can kick
Yeah.
points. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Delegation counterplan. What determines what's indigenous people land property status?
Probably tribal sovereignty and the status quo that are recognized by the federal government, because that's the same way the AF does it.
But now they have full jurisdiction over that?
Yes. Yeah.
What do you mean full jurisdiction over status? What
Like
does that mean?
no federal copyright, federal legal standards apply to indigenous land.
No, but that's a second link. I'm asking about the first
Federal
link.
and sovereign.
What do you mean you endow indigenous people with full jurisdiction over their status?
Yeah, like they can determine. It's like basically self-determination problems. Like certain indigenous nations now are not recognized federally, and so the federal government declares that they no longer have authority over those indigenous nations, and therefore they can make their own laws, make their own copyright standards, etc.
And now they have all their land to themselves now.
I mean, the ones that there's certain ones that have jurisdiction over creative works, which is the ones we specifically have outlined.
No. You said full jurisdiction over all land.
Yeah, we're
Over their land.
Yeah, their land.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking. Though.
Yes.
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. The second plank, so they can't copyright their work anymore.
There is no federal copyright jurisdiction over indigenous lands. Correct.
No, there's no copyright that indigenous people
Yeah,
cannot
well,
copyright their
we're
works.
making arguments about like indigenous standards for protecting creative works, but correct, like no federal copyright standards will apply anymore.
Okay, but it applies to everything else, not indigenous works.
Correct.
Okay. And then you scratched the second part of the third plank.
I sent out the correct.
Okay, sorry, I didn't see that. Adopt. Okay. Topicality. How does that not mean?
Yeah, so Sharifi says that the protection must be a legal.
Wait, actually, better question. Isn't fair use protection against unauthorized use?
You change, so you change the way fair use is applied. You don't like increase the amount of fair use in SQUO.
Yeah, like no, like fair use is explicitly an authorized use of copyrighted work.
No, the plan, fair use is explicitly something that protects against unauthorized use, like infringement.
No. Well, it provides exceptions to infringement, right? That when something is fair use, that you can't sue for infringement, right? So that is an authorized use of a copyrighted work.
Okay, sure, makes sense. Spillover. What card do you think you'd write about the second factor?
Our Dresbitsky evidence says that increased protection now specifically will cause the courts to take a different interpretation.
Dude, like
and
it just
stance
says
towards fair
copyright
use.
protection broadly causes some stuff. Like this isn't about the F at all.
Well, it's just talking about modifications to fair use doctrine and
No, it
how
doesn't.
those protections
No, it doesn't.
and fair
Okay,
use.
actually,
I got him. You've got to let
give
me
me
answer.
give me
finish my
one.
question if you
Wait,
want the
give me
answer.
like one sentence that you highlighted that says fair use in the first card.
Yeah. Well, it's talking. The first card.
Well,
is
yeah, you
about
can't,
use.
so I'm not gonna wait for you.
I was
But
about
I'm gonna like the first card.
I
Like
was just about to give it to you.
okay,
now.
give it to me.
Okay. Excessive protection result in stifling new works. Those are always derivative
Okay,
with
you
earlier
didn't say fair
creations.
use.
Okay,
Yeah, the next part is about fair use.
Probably sorry.
Seems like this stuff.
Spillovers and net benefit to delegation.
Probably. Yeah.
And sui generis?
Spillover.
Yeah.
Did you read all the cards?
No, they skip like the last two.
So you just read green, right?
Yep.
Stop. 720.
Wait, did you start at 10?
720.
Yeah. What's that? location advantage. Framing. T pre-existing. Sui generis. The deference counterplan. Curving. Spillover said. Did y'all read curving?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
So we're good.
Cultural appropriation compounds psychological, social, political harms upon indigenous communities, perpetuating a violent history of settler dispossession that diminishes tribal agency and sovereignty while ignoring urgent demands for legal rights. 121. This article is in the context of the federal government forced tribes to adopt the same federal copyright procedures. This is not the app, which is an opt-in system. Second, it's about superseding federal law, means they work together. The next paragraph concludes that they should still be able to use federal law, and the plan mitigates those problems. Week 21. The courts to mitigate potential violence and applying the second factor source focus on evidence, ontology, rather than inferences, tribal leader, knowledge about cultural content, private experts, and regarding the effects of appropriation, creative time, environment, courts have deference to the community's assessing nature. Third, it says it isn't a panacea, but that's not that it's a bad idea. It doesn't assume copyright being applied flexibly and works cannot be changed. Also, there's zero warrants here, and it's better than appropriation framing. Extinction doesn't outweigh first is impossible. Any approach or probability with the magnitudes insanely high makes decision making impossible. Second is eugenics. The calculation for the greatest number always sacrifices in minority groups. That's Schuster and Wood. Third is conjunctive fallacy. Two events is less likely than one. Anything else results in the worst forms of scenario planning and advocacy. Four is research creates a race to the bottom to only read extinction impact. 22. Does it do combination with probability analysis by presuming extinction risk as true. Structural violence founds a condition for existential risk and is papered over by existential studies. That's Schuster and Wood. This is second 1 and T2, not tautological. We've impacted the calculation of extinction, which disproves it, and that existential risk is improbable. All framing cards are specific to genocidal erasure of indigenous and marginalized populations if it's bad ethically, even if we're winning a probability and exaggeration claim. T. First is we meet functionally. The plan weakens fair use to safeguard works from unauthorized appropriation. This argument is incoherent because the plan obviously wouldn't say the words we weaken fair use. The plan is just an example of that. B, textually evaluating the plan text is the most objective standard. Anything else causes an onslaught of normal mean counterbalance and workplace counterinterpretation. Prediction includes proactive enforcement for availability, acquisition, scope of IBR, and enforcement. Roger, level 2. Prediction and dividing inclusive matters affecting availability, acquisition, scope, maintenance, enforcement, IB, trips, defense prediction. Third, prefer ASAP, ground forces, every have to be all about legal remedies, which supercharges not strong net generics and limits topic innovation. B, predictability. Our interpretation is clear and limit intended to define under standard international law that always guides research in terms limits, force, functional limits, solve sui generis, politics, econ. Other words, red words, cap, but limits outweigh their interpretation plus or at 5 reasonability. Good is good enough. Competing interpretation causes the race to the bottom. The sui generis counterpart. Permutation to the counterpart, the particularities of the second factor make it functionally sui generis. Shield spillover descents because the courts will interpret it only to indigenous works if the link is right. Ginsburg 24. The majority discussion of the second factor factor throughout the code is further than the core copy. The particularity of the nature of the copy is that of the works and shown to sui generis fair use fallacy because the reason to wonder about the protection of many products and understand the holding is good only present. Permutation to both shields and net benefit fails versus relegation. MC19. All rights associated with the past and infringement were extinguished by sui generis. Sui generis means the other provider do not find its context support. Prior to sell it and dismissal of sui generis over 6 of the courts ignore sui generis nature of right. It's a statutory limitation will lie. As if they were not needed. The court of literal justification lower courts the courts that determine a limitation part. One of the remedies for Aboriginal rights, the sui generis will be able to ignore at the same time used against Aboriginal pieces of title holding a room by claim only a breach of duty could solve for wrongs offended and is more for limitation pure sui generis severely prejudicial and undermines reconciliation. Second is heating demands. That was case per other issues. Counter plans must be textually and functionally competitive, maximize the germane comparison of ground and objectivity. No uncertainty. Deficit courts already know how to apply fair use, no spillover. That was above. And perm do the counter plan and conditionalities of voting issue time and strategy skill. The block gives negative advantages, not reciprocal. They can kick arguments and we can't have multiple plans. That promotes argumentative irresponsibility. This also often deference counter plan. Permutation do both. Read 20. The 10th Circuit held that copyright acts talent meant the trade cannot be subject to copyright. Majority as 5 Circuit presumes the law to apply unless laws interview required to cause self-governance to conflict in a relevant treaty. Permutation to the app and any combination of the plank perm to the app and plank 1 and 2 shields because plank 2 is the status quo. It is indigenous people to choice to use federal copyright, but they don't have to. It also solves because the plan does not specify what works it applies to. The counterplan is a further specification of fair use. Plank 1 also fails because it is the status quo. Permutation to the app and relegate determinations of fair use to indigenous communities links to net benefit. It has the U.S. force trying to adopt federal fair use standards that compete solely off of quote zero federal intervention when the counterplan plan results in it because it uses federal courts, or the app avoids because the plan is an opt-in system and doesn't intrude on federal courts through the counterplan. Analysis on creative environment requires bilateral analysis, and non-applicability is worse. Read 20. Eliminating federal protection would deprive federal tribal members of valuable property available to other makers of copyright rights is not enforceable on tribal lands, worse than tribal matters non-members could be applied to perm other issues perm to the app, and confer absolute independence to indigenous sovereigns. That is the sovereignty advocate, and non-tribal appropriation is a massive disadd to the counterplan that outweighs. Read 20. Tribe makes jurisdiction of non-tribal members when non-union member enters in relations or conduct threatens the tribe, but a tribal intellectual property laws enforceable those who never entered no of the federal legislative plan, those law federal enforcement team, reasonable action on federal taking cultural creativity, Corbyn counterplan. Perm to the app of the United States Congress, publicly supported by the President of the United States, should unanimously pass a concurrent resolution threatening the judiciary. It's sexually and functionally legitimate, only uses the plan in the counterplan, only does part of the counterplan. Limiting functional intrinsicness is good, requires neg evidence that proves and that benefit is germane, key to background and predictability. Artificial competitive counterplans or voter kill real-world education over opportunity costs while subsuming the full end result of the plan, making leveraging app offense impossible. If doesn't solve versus mass uncertainty, the counterplan sets a signal. The interpretations of law are political rather than unpredictable precedents. Second is courts say no. It reduces the legitimacy of EU commitments to treaties and multilateral broadly of courts must be held at a gunpoint to do the app. Third, judges value stability and predictability. One also know and adjudication to play central and discussing judicial reform, lawmakers and judges. If we leave a certain way of doing things, promote to see the system change, valuable stability, predictable, have the overtake the statute, period. Structural reform can be peaceably increased and human innovation. 4, congressional attempts to influence the court fail. Round 20 conservative invested decades in shaping the court and the federal judges all along the use of courts to mantle the liberal peace and rebelling attack carried out when the methodological efficiency by any type of democracy, the Roman court against entirely partisan averages of Sally, invaluable justice decision with politics. This rotates allow parts of the code to the judiciary. Perm to the plan doesn't have to be immediate, have Congress threaten, and then use it to do the plan. Perm to the counterplan, no internal net benefit versus no link. No one instance of court Kirby doesn't shape broad statutory controls that trigger extremism. Second, doesn't solve rule of law, makes the court look more partisan and loyal to other branches, and no impact to administrative state collapsing. Watch 20 administrators that multiplied exponentially over 400 federal agencies. Those agencies have lost decide punishment or revoked. Why the penalty overgrown administration does not enter the present Congress create an independent agency offers much more approve or remove large impossible establishment, ignore, obstruct, or undermine with the consequence. This there is no clear dissent. Card 0 is about the second factor, just generic copyright reform. They couldn't even explain it in context. It also says fair use doctrine is good. Their card is about what happened before the case. In yellow, tweet 23, the 9th Circuit came to the correct result on perfect 10. The facts before the 9th Circuit and Google v. Oracle disproves spillover. That's a read. Evidence is also a drop dissent from the 2C. They don't get new answers. Link to the plan is in line with the second factor's original intent and gives it its due meaning. That thumbs and predictability. That was read. Thumbers about 6 years of flexible copyright protection for software disproves a link. Jumble 20, software and copyright did not make copyright offense over different properties in 1964 copyrights and amount of copyright explicitly included programs of other countries followed. Mutual between copyright and software, national copyright find ways to navigate just and empirics disprove the industry's response to copyright protection is investment, not stagnation. First 18 international consensus of copyright over software. Congress expertly divide computer programs and literary essential pollinators. Treat programs that matter. Google still kind of implement APS and countless ways of protection, subject to context, protectional analysis panel, and and argue industry. Must have a bright line that limit the scope requirement more little one anti-counterfeiting. No other industry has a lack of bright line toward their progress. No only here. Legal consent programs are protecting an industry all respond by investing, nor to Oracle if you go and have a development. After 24, in either no link or new tech makes the dissent inevitable. Through 24, law of copyright development in response to technology, new technologies, Congress balance public interest and here, flexibility, copyright, primary mechanisms, fair use courts, freedom of depth, talk to the particular situation by case basis, as he understands the fair use, a context-based tag, and no spillover, it must be weighed. Read 21. Propose approach to provide a greater analytical power with creative environment, stable public with software loss of future creativity on nature, weight against fair use, however, environmental benefits, software tweets, contracts, or production, and has little need for controls nature. Support of fair use, the second factor must be weighed. This analysis of fair use, fair use, particularly within indigenous cultural context, and Warhol v. Ghostman, was a massive blow against fair use with thumbs to dissent. Palmer 24. Two most important factors are the purpose and character of the evidence report. The decision of the courts address the fair use only when the court considers whether the art is transformative or whether the court permitted for considering the meaning course. Decision error, the availability of fair use doctrine. Let me read another card. Okay, go back to the counterplan, the Corbyn counterplan. The counterplan doesn't solve the net benefit proposals such as core packing is perceived in extreme measures. Sequel 21, core packing remains extremely undermining court's independence, source legal and legitimacy imperative critical functions, pulling the trigger for severe damage to American political injecting threats of core packing to each of the election cycle waste stability of American constitutional democracy in central island for partisanship or essential disability.
Okay, good for crosslinks?
Let me send that out.
Okay. First, want to talk about the we meet on topicality. So,
does the plan like weaken fair use to prevent unauthorized?
Fair
Yes.
use doctrine is a method that allows other people to appropriate works. The AF makes it so it is difficult to apply fair use to indigenous works so that they cannot be appropriated.
So how does that make it difficult to use fair use?
Well, not difficult to make it fair use. It limits fair use applicability so that other people cannot apply the fair use doctrine and appropriate works from,
Wait, why is the fair use doctrine key? I'm a little confused.
what?
Why
No,
is the fair use doctrine key to that
Okay,
cultural
So
appropriation?
fair use works if, so for example, indigenous people have a copyright over something now. Someone infringes on that copyright. Indigenous people bring the case to court and they say, you have infringed on our copyright. The party that infringed will apply the fair use defense. That is that the unauthorized use was under fair use. The plan makes it basically makes courts rule in favor of indigenous people on the question of fair use so that their work cannot be
Okay.
stolen.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sui generis, this relegation Empson evidence, it's about Aboriginal peoples in Australia and Australian IPR. Why do you think this applies to an AF about U.S. domestic copyright?
Well, it's first about Canada, which has a very similar system to the Sui Generis program. The reason why this applies still is because it's about fair use broadly. It says that the ability for indigenous people to have full control over their copyrights and IP was enshrined in the Canadian Constitution.
Okay,
Yet,
so
court still found a way to overturn it.
okay, so the
Or
argument
like
here
not
is
overturn it,
that
but supersede it.
Canadian courts were able to circumvent laws under the Canadian Constitution, so American courts will circumvent laws under the U.S. Constitution.
Yes, because they literally use
Okay.
the same system. And
So
it's-
you're saying like the
if
Constitution of
Canadian
Canada and
courts
the
can-
Constitution of the U.S. are like the same?
What? No, it's that the fair use analysis in both of these countries is the same.
Wait,
the
wait,
U.S. is even
so
more
could you-
anti-indigenous
could you-
people on the question of courts.
I want to ask about like the evidence and where you're basing off that the Canada and the U.S.'s legal systems are the same. Could you point me to a highlighted line that makes a comparative claim about the similarity between these two countries?
I'm making the comparative claim now. The court.
Okay, so you don't have
the
a card.
Okay, the precedent set in Canada was that in their constitution, it was enshrined that indigenous people should have rights to their intellectual property. The courts ignored this, allowed multiple exceptions to their work. There is simply no reason why U.S. courts would not do the same thing. One, you've not read that evidence, but two, it is not even enshrined in
Okay.
our constitution for indigenous people to have their IP rights.
Yeah.
What makes you think that courts will
I wanna
be
move on
better
to-
than Canada?
I want to move on to the Kenny evidence. Where do you think this makes a claim about the federal government? Like, where do you think this says sui generis is bad?
No,
It just says
says that the
copyright is
plan
good.
is good because indigenous people have been calling on the government to adopt similar procedures in copyright.
10 minutes starting now. You stopped prep at 7:12.
The doc is sent. The order is the sui generis counterclaim, the sovereignty counterclaim, delegation, the appropriation advantage, and then frame.
Wait, can I have that again?
It's the sui generis counterclaim, delegation counterclaim, appropriation advantage, frame.
We're gonna take a little bit more prep. 7:20.
7:20. Yeah.
7:16.
16. Everyone good?
No.
Just let me know. Everyone good?
A sui generis regime solves the case protection is functionally identical to the plan, but avoids this spillover decide by protecting existing copyright law from distortion through a different label. Let's see about 2 frames. 1, sufficiency strikes deficits without an impact. Anything else encourages 2AC sandbagging and removes block advantage. 2, judge kick is the logical extension of condo. It borrows useful access aspects from traditional IP, eliminating any deficit fills. 92, sui generis the plan and regulated IP rights and would incorporate various IP frameworks to tailor the program's exact needs of the industry press, protect the economic interest. 2AC 1 is perm to the counter plan. It severs. It's devoted for shiftiness. 1, IPR. The counter plan creates a legal right to exclusivity, but it's not an intellectual property right. Rule 5. The legal rights are from a sui generis written down and IPR. It's unique economic criteria. The return for investment. 2 is in means within. KC 9 in within the boundaries of it. Also cannot. This means the app cannot be the counter plan. A is legally. The counter plan is not a derivative instrument of standard IP. It falls outside the existing regimes due to inability to fit with new standards. That's Kaziva. B is common definition. The counter plan literally protects the plan outside of copyright, patent, or trademark. That's Kaziva. 24 sui generis right refers to specific subject matter different from copyright, patent, or trademarks or patent. They reflecting the literal meaning of and of its own kind. Preferred plain meaning I live in this house does not mean I should build a new house to live in. Scalia. 12 words of ownership by ordinary everyday meanings most fundamental and the most semantic rule of interpretation. Every word should be expounded on its common sense. Preferred A is limits its topics. A nightmare for the negative. Absolutely legalize weed uphold the status quo via antitrust or procedurally speed up IP filings from using individual agencies with zero unified negative offense. Sui generis is the only viable topic generic that constrains an ocean of app that enforces the money sees to have a robust defense of its topic area. The alternative is a massive limits explosion to apps in new sui generis areas that no links every dissent, IP comments, moral rights, etc. All these are sui generis schemes that render the topic bidirectional and untenable for the negative. B is ground. Spillover and Clark Clog are the only universal dissents. Sui generis is the only way for the negative to stay alive versus new and tiny apps that no offense counterclaim test the app's topic area and requires specific contextualization for every app coupled with very specific dissents. It's the bare minimum on an app bias topic. Then they should have been prepared. Now they say their card just says that sui generis has been applied in similar ways, and the app is a break from existing IP law. It doesn't make it a sui generis regime, and the counterplan is also not a patent, which it's not a copyright, which means that it severs that textually as well. They say do both. It severs or it links. One is the counterplan bans the plan. The term sui generis is the only one of its kind. Samuelson, 85 sui generis is defined as of its own class, and only one of its kind. IPR regimes cannot be combined. Even 95, the current IP regime in the U.S. limits the owner one type of production, invoking one type includes concurrent methods. 2 is that it does not solve and link to this spillover dissent. A is doctrinal overlay. The combination of IP regimes for the plan renders it impossible to effectively determine the scope of rights, which triggers spillover to legal distortion by triggering clarity or by destroying clarity for the courts, and only the counterplan alone solves. That's Kaziva. B is inconsistency. Samuelson, 85, multiple layers of protection and widespread use of multiple inconsistent forms that Congress is concerned about preserving traditional boundaries that bounds law, which rights to sui generis not be devised to producers no longer separate layers of protection. The courts be spared the problems of sorting out the rights. C is overgrowth. This is an independent link to the spillover dissent. Mies, 15, the illusion of various fields simultaneous protection, at least TIP overgrowth in fields that overlap to react with careful balancing, properly sequestering their own fields cuts, and both cutting back the overgrowth. It is time to give their own pastures sui generis legislation, not combined with very categories long stars, not accept these overlap and protection. They say the relegation deficit, it's a non-starter, is context. This card is about the Canadian legal system, not and then for Aboriginal peoples. This is literally settler homogenization because they've assumed all Indigenous peoples and rights, and even legal systems are the same. That's that was Tuesday Cross and MBA ACL Epson 19 infringement of Aboriginal title Aboriginal people not be defended on the Canadian legal system. B is fiat solves. It says that the court should avoid traditional application of property. It solves the counterblend fiat's an independent regime that does not evaluate property traditionally. Into Tuesday Epson 19 courts must be careful to avoid the application of traditional common law because laws of property do develop their own understanding of sui generis nature. It says the Aboriginal rights is sui generis and that the courts implemented sui generis incorrectly. The counterblend solves by implementing it correctly. The problem that the Epson card outlines is that it says they don't define what the nature of the work is. Read the counterblend text. It does in the same way that the plan does. It defines the ontological nature of works and their effects on the creative environment, which is exactly how the plan determines it. So if they can't, so if we can't solve it, they can't either. If it does, so it does fix the problems of the Canadian legal system. Traditional IPR is a poor fit for Indigenous cultural traditions. Protection to do sui generis regime. Kelly 7. Native cultural property resolved around culturally significant info unauthorized exploitative use of property on infringement for ownership rights, interest in managing harms and misappropriation and inherently different traits of TK resolution involved in the adoption of amended IP that a legislation not be recognized inherent difference between copyright laws and property cumulatively generated by a family of just retroactive applications sui generis law account for the diverse interests of native peoples and the most effective long-term solution. They say heating demand, it's neg. Their indigenous people depart from existing regimes. Teresa Kenny 11 that and departure from existing legal frameworks, no impact. The protection is identical, so even if the demand is currently for property appropriation is still prevented as a result. They say the certainty deficit, it's wrong, fiat solved. They have no evidence for this and none assume barriers to the status quo. The counterplan creates a scheme immediately with no delays, copying every necessary feature to create uncertainty, no impact. Their words are about the absence of protection from appropriation, not the mere uncertainty of legislation itself, which links equal to the app because there's no way that they guarantee Indigenous people because they've been lied to in the past by the government, so they're equally uncertain about the plan's production. The counterplan is more certain versus legal environment. A sui generis regime for the plan ameliorates existing deficits by preventing oversights from free riders and encouraging robust innovation. That's because you have an turns case attempting to shoe her in the app into existing IP regimes, zero solvency, friend and Robin. 22. Every IP regime is attempted to resolve different problems and corresponding different ways each IP regime is done with a specific set of trade-offs amount to make them clear that not when creators of different forms of serves IP carefully calibrating balance of creators avoiding requirements, type of competition, tech advances. They say condo, we get what we did. One, neck flex, capable counterbalance are key. IPRs nebulous requires multifaceted testing, distance, or few and non-unique absence back as solvents to the 2C first class species. They perfect instances and vague plans. 2, condo bad is an unpredictable, not logic. Condo bad is an unpredictable, non-resolution rule that denies the negative status quo, which should always remain a logical option. Arbitrary rules are worse than no rules, allowing the app to unilaterally reach all the bounds of every debate, displacing substance. 3, concede from reasonability. The theory debates crowd out substance. 3 is innovation. Paul White tries to encourage new arts learning research. 4, info processing. Hard one to seize. 4, suicide eventually best answers, fostering critical thinking. Now defense. 1, DMU adding more policy, aptitude, speaking values, strategic liabilities. Q, inevitability. Disad speed, highlighting framework case. Reject dispo. 1, definition of consensus. There is none. 2, force perms, process counterplans, world peace plank. 3, can't solve like suicide. Takes the block. Sovereignty counterplan. Concede the perms. Test competition. Not going forward. Appropriation advantage. The turn outweighs. Reed concludes that copyright law causes tribalist possession, which materially and epistemologically disrupts tribal sovereignty and ruins tribal livelihood. That means that the app actively makes cultural appropriation worse and has the external impact of native livelihood and subsistence. The app not only makes it easier for settlers to appropriate native work, but also tanks native self-protections, which are external cultural appropriation, which means we have a DA that encompasses their impact and external terms of case. We also have terminal defense. Reed concludes that copyright cannot be a panacea for tribal creators who get hampered by settler copyright protections because that negates native self-expression, which answers the first argument. It's not necessarily about the federal government having to force natives because it's about asserting the new system and changing the copyright standard, which is de facto a forcing upon natives because they don't get a choice as for how the federal government defines what is an ontological work. And they say it supersedes federal law. They can't fiat this. Again, when you say crossing said it's not a mandate of the plan to work with indigenous people. So the immediate effect is that they're telling indigenous people what is and what is not a good creative work. Here's they say copyright it's applied flexibly. Copyright law necessitates a sense of individualism that destroys indigenous sovereignty and worsens cultural appropriation. Read 21. Entering the world of commercial music has always been limited by copyright act. Given up the copyrights given in exchange for royalties and given up artistic control to remain using the canon won't allow me copyright. Cross-regularly loose principles giving ownership to creativity raises challenges for creators like the composers share a song and blogs to society that ownership transfer to entire bills to hold copyright acts does not recognize these transfers. When people now say come to me and say can I use this song, I want to say yes, but I can't because I'm bound by copyright terms. The conflict between Hopi and copyright law has composed it. I believe the copyright terms apply to Hopi songs and the copyright utility and the reservation board. It requires a disembodiment which is alignment with rationality that violates native release and sovereignty. Read 21. To receive protection of the Copyright Act, the author must fix their works in a place of resentment and copyright activity comes disembodied. Mark it disembodied.
Okay, you good?
Yep.
The sui generis counterplan, you've read multiple things. Okay, does the counterplan enact the same protections as the AF?
Substantively, yes. But the
Substantively, yes.
the
So-
moniker is different.
Okay, so
Sui
for example,
generis is-
this under this sui generis regime, like someone's indigenous cultural work has been appropriated. What does the counterplan then do?
the same thing as the app. It
The
would,
same thing as
yeah, it would.
The
It would probably
counterplan,
spur
firm to
legal
the
suits for
counterplan
infringement.
answers have been that sui generis is only sui generis if it is distinct from current
Yes,
copyright
the
protection.
point is that it is not a patent, copyright, or trademark.
No, you can't just call it not a patent, copyright,
Yes,
or
yes,
trademark and
like,
then apply
yes,
the
it's
same definitions
No,
to
it is
That's
legally
not
de-
what sui generis
Sui
is.
generis is one of a kind, i.e., you can apply whatever protections we've specified in the counterclaim
Okay,
text.
what are
The exa-
whatever protections?
Yes, our 1 and C evidence, the Kaziva card says that you can specify and tailor those sui generis regimes
What
to
are the
specific
tailorings?
instances. The tailorings are that it is the same as the plan. Like it is
What?
protecting ontological
No,
creation
okay,
work.
so let's talk about this Kelly card you read on the answer to MSIG. You've said that current copyright fails, a sui generis regime that accounts for cultural difference is key. What part of the counterplan expands upon copyright
Yeah.
law that makes it different?
Yeah.
Like, does it remove the fixation requirement?
No,
does
no,
it
no.
remove
So,
authorship requirements?
like the whole point is that it's more flexible than the plan's stringent
Okay,
requirement
you've
for
said
fair
the
use.
word. It's
You
more-
adapt to existing standards for fair use
Okay,
copyright,
look, you've
which
said-
is legally distinct from sui generis.
Okay, you've said the counterplan is more flexible than
Yeah.
current copyright. What part of the new sui generis regime is different?
It's tailored to ontological works.
How?
The Reed card talks about the strict nature, on the one I read on case, the strict nature of existing copyright regimes makes people, like indigenous people, even if the app says like you consult indigenous people or you like allow stakeholders
No,
to
that's
come to
not
the
my
table.
question.
The
My
point
question
is that those standards are too stringent for even the plan to modify.
And the counterplan adopts the same
Yes, because
standard,
being
but
out-
calls it sui generis.
being
Okay,
outside
you
the
know,
legal
this
regime, right?
term
Being
is
outside
not
the legal
never-
regime.
the
Being
term
outside
is
the legal
not-
regime
okay.
of copyright allows for more flexibility, allows for courts to
can
interpret
you
things
put the
differently, which the Gazebo Code all say.
Okay, let's talk about this turn on case. You've said that it makes settlers appropriate more. What's the warrant?
I mean, the Reed card talks about the lack of being able to like share indigenous creations. There's a lot of like specifically for the Hopi tribe, he talks about
Share
like,
indigenous creations.
Yeah, like-
why is that something that the plan worsens?
something that the plan worsens because you apply the second fair use factor, which is
How does
existing
how does
copyright
the
standard.
second fair use factor apply to whether
Okay,
or not
literally
indigenous people can
the
share
Reed
work?
card is very specific. It is your 1AC author.
No,
that says
because
that
you've
applying
cited a Reed
copyright-
article different from the fair use as
yeah,
cultural
same,
appropriation.
okay, like
This is
same
a distinct
author,
article.
yeah, same author, obviously.
Different context.
Yeah, okay, it's different context maybe, but it says that applying second
It
fair
is the
use
different
and
context
specifically
that
for
matters.
federal copyright standards prevents indigenous people from sharing their songs, their music, and different creations.
How?
Because
Like-
they're bound by the law. The courts will deny
Can you
them
give me
the-
a? You said bound by
Yes,
the law.
the law now says that they are not fair use, and the app would expand.
Speed press.
They're taking.
Oh, we are taking.
Okay,
Yes.
sorry.
It is distinct from copyright. All the negatives are sui generis being distinct. The counterplan does not do anything different. So it doesn't have any benefit, and it's not competitive.
Here, just take it. Yeah. 642. Sending it.
The order is going to be framing, the court curbing counterplan, and then the spiller video.
Okay, I'm good.
Wait. Wait. Framing.
Core curbing, and then spillover DA.
I can go, sorry.
All right, I'm good.
Extinction of waste, one scope instantly wipes out 8 billion lives, far more than the app saves. 2, it turns case, precludes future improvements to quality of life for indigenous people. 3, it turns suffering, it blocks out the sun, subjecting everyone to a cold, painful, and slow freezing deaths, as well as starvation, radiation poisoning, and global fire warming. That outweighs under the app's framing as well. 4, we also have a counterplan that solves the case, so winning framing doesn't have to be as large if we were going for DA case alone. Infinitarian policies is wrong. 1, no link, we don't count future lives, just 8 billion existing ones. 2, they link the people that die also from the app also have effect on future gens and decision making. Yes, the 1, no link, we're winning a sufficiently large risk of the DA from technical debating. We agree that there is a point at which probability is low enough to disregard an impact, but that's not applicable to the DA. The incalculability stuff 1 judge solves. Even if they can't be exact, they can decide probability through technical debating. We can still take 3 scenarios, even if we don't know every single detail. 2, we're winning a high risk of the DA, even if you still can't figure out exactly how much. Vote neg to stop a reasonable risk of the death of aliens. 3, they link you can't calculate the risk of the app either. Eugenics is wrong. Our interpretation doesn't necessarily cause it. It treats everyone same and uses the values of pain and pleasure, which are objective. Their interpretation isn't actually an interpretation because it doesn't. They haven't explained how they can avert from eugenics. And conjunctive policies wrong. McGuire, Article 18. Learning states with the effect that not only persons learning they know they are, rather than a blind spot conjunction reflects uncertainty via words. The effects were left to reflect a deficiency of tendency to interpret a verbal description. The reconstitution model, the burden of proof should be placed on. There is a presumed psychological instruction if we don't assume observation. Independent judgments are independent judgments will rarely obey the rule of notion. Construction of representative fallacies and trends are results of stress. Error on the experimenters and expect probability to apply for most the scenarios. Conjunction does not hold because participants learn. I need prediction stuff. Yeah, give me prediction stuff. And the research offense is non-responsive because they've not explained why researching existential risks are wrong and predictions are accurate. Board 13. Effects are critical code of predictions now 11 at the end of the Cold War. Never press your collective vote and process the data increases reasonably insufficient ability to ensure effective policy in which predictions become commonplace. Scholars and research we can trade research and limited and capabilities to advances the result. Here Latin has 30,000 citations with use as evidence. Scientists are bad for curriculum. While the off the market influence research can be improved by attention to predictions. Market predictions. Core curving. Concede the permits to sex competition. It's a reason to reject the argument, not the team. Spillover. Internet collapse is existential fragmentation distorts collaboration necessary to respond to a range of existential threats, such as disease, climate, war, and require mutual observation and discussion to understand and mitigate. That requires interconnected internet. That's Meryl. The impact goes drop. You know the internet collapse happens, and you know that the DA is key for it, which means you error if it turns the case without an effective internet. It hurts indigenous culture around the world. 1, cultural preservation and sharing. The internet allows indigenous communities to document and share cultural heritage, preserving traditions for future generations. For example, the Maori in New Zealand use digital platforms to teach their children. 2, communication. The internet provides indigenous people with a platform to raise awareness about issues affecting their communities and advocates for their rights. For example, the Standing Sewage Tribe and Stop NADPL use social media to take down settler colonial institutions. 3, community building. Indigenous people in remote areas use the internet for education and learning and contact. And look, the 2 is the only contested the link of this DA. They've conceded uniqueness, the internal link, and the impact, which means that if you find a reasonable list of the DA, you know the rest of the DA. It's 100% because they have not contested it. You can't just defer to their framing because technical debating outweighs. Otherwise, judges arbitrarily insert their biases in the debate. I'll briefly extend the entire DA except for the link. The server test, which ruled on the fair use doctrine, resolved disputes between Google and Amazon, ensuring that they were able to find resolution. This decision relies upon an expansive decision on fair use because it's how it maintains its existence in the status quo. Expanding fair use disrupts other copyright destructions. We don't need specific evidence considering that 1 and C tweak says that fair use doctrine is key. 1 is complexity. The plan reforms copyright system for ontological works that creates confusion due to blurred divisions between new users and creators. 2EC Crosslinks was clear. They redefine and limit the way that fair use doctrine is or interpreted in the quo. Conceded uniqueness, which is that courts are taking a broad, expansive interpretation of fair use, but the plan is a bolt from the blue because it takes a quote limiting and curbing approach towards fair use doctrine, which is taxing for the judges and forces overhaul of existing doctrines. That's risky. And 2 is goal shifting. The plan repurposes copyright system for ontological work that creates inflexibility with existing works and invites litigation. Search risky evidence as well. The thumpers group them. 1, link magnitude determines them. A, context are evident. It's about small disputes, and that might be a slight departure from existing fair use, but not a wholesale disruptive. And they conceded our scenario, when specifically our uniqueness. The case that determined server test was in 2023, which means thumpers from before then are irrelevant. And 2, priced in uniqueness frames a link. The courts are taking a new approach now. The plan may be in line with second factor, but that doesn't mean whether or not the court has now taken a broad expansion of fair use, departing from the Google v. Oracle decision. And Trimble doesn't matter. It doesn't assume the new shift that courts have started to take that was uniqueness above. We get answers to the read card, considering that the link was in the 1 and C. Disruptions in fair use cause internet collapse. Drop to 1, stability. The current service test safeguards the navigation of search engines. Otherwise, litigation against Google and Amazon upends the modern internet via rapid collapse at SWE. And 2, the sector that was dropped, and the app spills over, even if it isn't about fair use. Overstretched Mantega. 24. Copyright is illegal Swiss Army knife copyright applied in ways that extend far outside original scope. Fair use stands on precarious grounds. Flexibility, fair use doctrine is double edged. Rules could solidify interpretation may have not been foreseen outcomes that have significant precedence. Market precedence.
648.
Wait, on case, which cards did you read?
Like on the advantage?
Yeah.
The first 2 read cards.
Okay.
advantage, framing, counterplan. I got Decide.
Advantage, framing, counterplan.
decide.
Okay.
Is it just this card? Is it just the doc called like their first card, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I didn't have time to title it. Okay.
I'm opening it. Give me a second.
Like these. Who's iPost round?
It's like a Google group. It's actually theirs. Yeah.
So we
it's
have
like IPR. I post around.
I was like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, that's cute. I was like, should I be scared?
Okay, everyone's good.
The turn at zero is not unique because the plan does not expand copyright protection to hurt group rights or interconnectivity, but it makes it harder to appropriate current works that have protection. Current copyright flexibility also allows things like group rights, lack of fixation, etc. to be applied in the status code that was dropped. Fuentes, Crossing so sad they cannot identify the specific links to the plan, and they've dropped every indict. First is a re-highlighting of read is the next paragraph. It says that settler courts mitigate bias by applying the second fair use factor and have expert testimony by sovereign native nations. Second is the second read card. It's about imposition of copyright provisions dropped on delegation counterplan that the plan would not apply if it's intruded on sovereignty. That's a 9th and 10th Circuit decision. The third card does not say the app is bad, nor does it provide a warrant. Fuentes supersedes this because it says that allowing tribes to have broad group rights where copyright does not hurt them, that still concludes appropriation broadly, is bad. 2NC1 that was answered above by Fuentes, and it's not unique because it's the status code. 2NC2 is also answered by Fuentes, which is that the current copyright doctrine is flexible enough to solve the fixation requirement. And either way, they've dropped another red card from the delegation counterplan that non-applicability of federal copyright deprives a necessary right against appropriation, which is worse. Framing. X central does not outweigh one stat. Low probability with high magnitude is based on an impossible data point, which moots decision making correct for normative bias towards larger internal link. Second, your ratio calculation for the greatest number of sacrificial genocide and endemic to policy making. Scope is wrong. Extinction is unlikely, and threats are endemic to policy making. This is all lives matter that detracts from current violence. Does not turn the quality of life. That's not unique and was done above. They say the counterplan saws it's going to be below. They say no link. They need to get extinction first, which we've said is unpredictable because it assumes an impossible data point that was done above, and it answers their predictions card. Technical debating is wrong. You should overcorrect for the ubiquity of extinction impacts in debate and perverse imagination to justify disads. They say Judge Saul, this is incoherent because indigenous violence is incalculable right now, and they said that we should reduce it. They say high risk of a disad. Wrong. This is one piece of link evidence and it will be below. They say eugenics is wrong. Again, this is endemic to preserving future generations, which is what the disad does. They say no research. Wrong. Extinction impacts are super widespread in debate, which is also done above. Sui generis. Do the counterplan or do both. It's not exclusive. Acknowledging ontological nature identifies the particularities of protection to each work and its effects on a creative environment. That shields and net benefits. SCOTUS revealed if a particular analysis of the second factor undermines protection for any other products, they will treat it as sui generis. The first card is for creatives and databases in Europe. The second card is irrelevant because the counterplan uses the same methods of protection as per Crossex, or it cannot solve because it does not use the existing second factor legal doctrine that involves stealing of it in its works. Competition is not applicable. Double bind. Either it magnifies the relegation disad because sui generis cannot adopt any traditional copyright mechanism, or it's the same as the app. This is the worst form of debate. Imagine saying all the protections are the same, but saying we use a different word, so now it's distinct and it competes. It's not severance. The plan is it's not sui generis, but it's treated as such. Other definitions are also nonsensical, and it is people engage in songs, novels, and traditional works. Relegating those specifically to an alternative framework is more confusing, which was read that was done above. Now, I'm going to extend the relegation disad here. Sui generis as this thing is an opportunity for unchecked settler dispossession. One is rights. All past copyright remedies were extinguished and ignored. Second, ignorance. The court ignored sui generis, was spilled over to lower courts. That's Empson. It cannot solve the app in his groups, cannot seek remedies or have their claims litigated in the same way, which disproves counterplan competition and links in net benefit. They say Canada, it's irrelevant, prefer empirical evidence of how courts litigate sui generis in the context of it in its works, and Canada had the identical system to the counterplan. It's not homogenization, but an analysis of how courts will interpret the word sui generis. They say Fiat solves that's wrong, and there's a text flaw. It has the U.S. examine ontological nature, but it has zero legal remedies of fair use to weigh it against, and it's wrong because Canada superseded sui generis under the guise that it was different from before and applied whatever they wanted. There's no deficit. The counterplan works the same way as the app, which is involved. Indigenous laws draw upon copyright law, heeding their demands for federal. Follow-on is key to cultural sovereignty. It also applies if it's completely distinct from copyright protections, which means there's no net benefit or competition argument because the counterplan is indistinct from current copyright protection. There's no link to the diss ad. They have zero card that exists about the second factor, just generic copyright and fair use, which already exists now. In order for you to vote on this, you need to, one, somehow think their cards are good, but second, explain in the RFD how using the second factor somehow kills the internet. Their first card isn't about the app. Instead, generic copyright protections and licensing schemes for proprietary code. It also proves thumpage, which is inserted in for reference. The tweet card is about a ruling against Google, which is not the plan. Their card actually gives us a link turn because it says a Ninth Circuit decision that focused on fair use was good. Extend to EC Rub. Copyright leads to new tech and has inherent flexibility. Fair use is case by case, but if you somehow think they have a link, there's a turn. Hers says that protection of copyright has empirical responsive investment into every industry. Now, this is an example of a bad one in R. They rambled for 3 minutes about how we dropped the diss ad and then read zero cards on the link, which is the only part that we contested. There's no new 2NR extrapolation because the 2AC literally indicted their cards and they're just throwing around the word drop. The Mantenga card, one, it proves more thumpers. Mantenga 24, if we ever learned anything in the context of copyright remedies have been used. Second is more thumpers. The link is already applied. Mantenga 24, copyright is already applied in problematic ways. Third, it's not about fair use. Or in the context of the plan. Thumpers are kill or extend Trimble. We've been copywriting since the 60s and there's been mutual effects between copyright and software. They say link magnitude that was done above. They say small disputes. That's not just the case. Software is already copyrightable. DRM exists, and there's things like couch shift, trade secrets, patents, and even court cases. There's no card saying internet is key for communication and learning. The root cause is copyright, which was done on case. There's all causes, and they can learn through other sources. This is about relative internet decline, not absolute, which means it does not apply to indigenous people.
7:16.
Yeah, go. 16.
The order is the sui generis counterplan and the spillover decide. You can pass me some.
I'm good.
Awesome. Good.
The counterplan solves the case and creates a bespoke legal regime that implements identical protections to copyright, circumventing any distortion or spillover problems of the plan. The framing issue is that Greenhill is debating the worst version of this counterplan. Our counterplan can define the ontological nature of the works and their effect on creative environment because they apply the same standard as the app to what is a creative work. Do both is kill, drop the counterplan, bans the plan. Sui generis must, quote, be of its kind, which permits zero allowances for other protections in the same area. That Samuelson also dropped overgrowth explicitly flagged, and the 2NC has another link to the spillover decide. So it should frame the thumbers, which is one error is silent on when the IP systems overlap. It creates conflicting signals to the courts, which compels them to extend protections in other areas, which magnifies spillover. That's me. Do the counterplan fails. The one error reads zero definitions and concedes most of our sui generis. It's a completely different legal regime. It's not a patent, copyright, nor is it a trademark. It might be an intellectual property right in the traditional sense, in that it protects copyright, but it is not a copyright, which is what the resolution mandates. There are cards about the secondary use factor being a part of being functionally sui generis. Just makes the plan not topical. It doesn't make pertinent to the counterplan win, because we've read evidence about the resolution that they obviously must be a copyright, patent, or trademark. So if they're right that the secondary fair use factor is sui generis, then vote neg on topicality, because they've dropped our definitions. They've also dropped that sui generis is not an IPR, so because it's exclusive and categorically distinct, because it's not, it's the whole point is that it's a version from existing IPR regimes to be, quote, one of a kind, which circumvents all their part of the counterplan arguments. They also dropped every one of our standards. The topic's incredibly biased. Asks, can topically legalize weed or from the status quo with antitrust, which short circuits any decides, which are few and far between. There, the counterplan is key to keep the neg in the game, and they get clear deficits based on copyright doctrine being key. For example, our Led Zeppelin app, which has raised arguments about the prior art doctrine being incorporated into copyright, gives clear examples why changing and amending copyright doctrine and not another doctrine like sui generis is key. They could have made the deficits about the second fair use factor being a specific change to the copyright policy that is necessary. Other fair use factors or other similar identical regimes don't apply because it's about the copyright standard. But they haven't read internal links intrinsic to that, and their deficits are only about sui generis bad, not their thing is good. Specific internal link and to innovation make the counterplan not unbeatable. So even if the protection is substantially identical, it still grants us this counterplan because it's key to debatability. Uniqueness is decisively neg on limits, so it's tried. Now, the deficit is incredibly low risk. Relegation is certainly solved by fiat. There are warrants about the courts ignoring suits can happen in a world where they fiated the exact same provisions for how the courts can determine what an ontological work means. They also drop that if they're right about the deficit, it links just as much to the plan because the plan applies that same determination. They say there was counterplan text law. No, we do provide the same remedies. That's what protection means. It includes remedy scope and infringement. That's otherwise how can you protect the work in the plan? Either they also drop their cards are also about Canada. They've asserted the whole debate that the systems are the same without evidence or gazebo card. It's about U.S. system, which is categorically distinct because there's about Aboriginal peoples in Canada. We've read evidence specific to Indigenous people in the United States. Their systems in the Hopi are unique and they need different cultures and music to have one of a kind protections. They also drop Turn's case, shoehorning a fair use exemption in IPR policy causes more confusion and increases the court's likelihood to misinterpret bad policy remedies. That's a bench jar, and that means I don't have to go to case because we're many that the counterplan alone solves better than solves for the appropriation offense, and independently that Turn's case thing is presumption valid. Spillover. The dissent outweighs and turns the case. The internet collapse cascades across the globe, resulting in mass death, starvation, climate change, and nuclear war, all of which control outweigh cultural appropriation. You can hedge your bets on the counterplan solving enough of the app to justify a small risk of a deficit against a huge risk of the dissent. But even if you don't buy that, you can vote neg on Turn's case alone. Got them drop all the 1 in our subpoints, which means you have to err neg because you know for certainty that it precludes them from solving their impacts. A is cultural appropriation. Indigenous communities use the internet to document their cultural heritage and educate their kin. Class precludes that and causes erasure of indigenous violence. B is communication. The internet provides a means of resistance against the state by allowing indigenous people to communicate against other crackdowns. The link is huge. Hold them to what their evidence says and what Crossix explains. The court takes an expansive fair use doctrine for the status quo that upholds their server test because they are able to ensure that the broad fair use interpretations are maintained. Or 1C tweak evidence says that expansive interpretation of fair use doctrine is the only thing keeping it alive, and that none of it matters to their cards about the second fair use factor because the Tweezy Crossix says they change status quo interpretation of fair use. The plan definitely trades off. Drop the complexity link from the 1 in the plan redefines the limits of the fair use doctrine, which is categorically changes how we interpret copyright reuse. That's Gotchowski. All the highlights go negative for the copyright law is tenuous now, but that the fair use spillover is occurring. This frames the thumpers. A is that none of them about fair use. Drop the Ninth Circuit server test relies on fair use doctrine. That's the tweak evidence. And B is that they should strike all thumpers because our evidence, our scenarios from 2023 in their want to see tweak evidence as post states that. So now is key. Their internal link turn is wrong. Software innovation isn't key to our internal link. The server test is about broad internet providers, which they've written evidence about property and copyright broadly, not fair use broadly. So it is key to the internet, which solves all their gripes with our internal link plus
Very small risk of deficit on the counterclaim. Any risk of
1, 2, 3. Framing, counterplan. Dissad. Oh my god. Is anyone? You're voting F. The tuner did not go to the framing page, which means that they have dropped that any risk of structural violence outweighs any type of extinction impacts. The F is a prerequisite, and a reason why any deficit to the counterplan outweighs the dissad. They have dropped a terminal advantage to the framing page, which says that you should prioritize any risk of structural violence, even over a massive risk of extinction impact, because broadly that is inapplicable. Appropriation is extinction, the dissolution of political and physical culture and sovereignty. It collapses indigenous economies, decreasing their resources and income to sustain communities to sovereignty. Framing is an advantage to the F that is dropped. They've dropped that framing, and existential risk analysis is endemic to policy, which means that voting F corrects for that ballot in debate by spilling over to other rounds. I know this might seem silly, but it's dropped because existential risk analysis, specifically in debate and research, is key, because a debate is framed by extinction impacts. We go to camp, we research so many things about extinction impacts to race to the bottom. That structurally ignores extinction impact. You have dropped an impact that is endemic to policymaking, and that only voting F solves it. I don't need to do anything else on this debate, even if I lose every other part of the flow, because if that drop framing is a reason to vote affirmative. The sui generis counterplan. The counterplan is functionally the same thing as the F, which means permutation to the counterplan looks exactly the same. It doesn't matter if we're losing competition arguments, because the Ginsburg evidence says that the word sui, if the plan looks functionally the same as the counterplan, even if we're not do literally the word sui generis, the counterplan, the F looks identical to what a sui generis regime would say. They've dropped the Ginsburg evidence, which says that Thomas in the Supreme Court decision on Google v. Oracle said that if the second factor would spill over and hurt protection to other areas and undermine protection or spill over, they would treat the area as sui generis, which means that if the counterplan, if the link to the dissad is true, the Supreme Court and lower courts will treat it as a case only specific to indigenous works, which is that all of their arguments. They say the counterplan is sui generis, it's not patent copy copyright trademark. This doesn't matter. It doesn't sever because it looks exactly like the plan. Not that the plan literally is a counterplan. That is our competition argument. Not that we are winning. Yeah, it's not severance. They say in the topic example, this it doesn't matter. The counterplan, even if the counterplan is indistinct, it says the words, let's do the app, but call it sui generis, which is functionally, and then suddenly says that bans the plan. That is a nonsensical competition argument. Their arguments for competition supercharge the relegation dissent, which I will do below, but it doesn't matter because the competition argument is that it has to be distinct from current copyright law to call it sui generis. If the counterplan does the exact same thing, their competition arguments are not about the counterplan. Either the counterplan does nothing and it's the same as the app and links to dissent, or the app is the counterplan. Now the relegation dissent is the reason why you vote app on framing. It says that when it is called sui generis, courts will interpret the word sui generis to be distinct from any type of copyright protection in the status quo, and means that they can apply whatever type of analysis they want, devoid from precedent, etc. That makes it linked harder to the net benefit because courts have the jurisdiction to do whatever they want to indigenous people. This is a relegation dissent. They say that this is what's very true in Canada, where first they used rights, all past copyright remedies were extinguished. They didn't allow any type of legal remedy, which zeroes the counterplan. Second is ignorance. The courts ignored the words, they ignored past remedies because it was under the word sui generis. That was Empson. They say it's about Canada. Irrelevant. Prefer empirical evidence about courts litigate sui generis in the context of indigenous works. They have not read evidence that the U.S. has sui generis programs about indigenous people in the status quo, and they are more racist than Canada on this question. Then Canada had the identical system to the counterplan. You can just read about it after the round, but Empson assumes it's not homogenization, but analysis. But courts will interpret the word. They say fiat solves wrong. They've dropped that there's a text flaw. It says that the U.S. examine ontological word has zero remedies for fair use, etc. It is not literally that the courts will ignore the second factor in the sui generis decision. It is that the courts look at the word sui generis and ignore any sort of predicate. That means, yeah, they say Hobie system. This is irrelevant to the dissent. Dissent is zero link. The issue with the tuner is they assert that we dropped it, but they're going for a dissent with zero applicability to the app or second factor, just generic copyright and fair use, which are already things in the status quo. You need to find one card that says that the changing of fair use in the context of the second factor causes spillover and somehow destroys the entire internet. They've dropped the read evidence that says that it's in line with the intent of copyright, which answers all their stare decisis links. Now all of their link cards are horrible and ours are better. Another issue with the tuner is they gripped every re-highlight, which is distinct. First is offense. You don't really think there's a link, it's better for the internet. They've dropped 2EC hers, which has been clearly extended, and thus the protection of copyright has an empirical responsive investment into every industry. Second is defense. First is none of their anti to the 1EC card. It's about generic copyright protection, which isn't the plan in licensing scheme. It also proves that thumpers, because it says that, quote, it's been proven how fragile digital evolution may be, and that the link has been, quote, demonstrated better earlier. That zero is unique. Second, the tweak card is about ruling against Google in the, quote, perfect 10. Nothing about this is a plan. They've also dropped that tweak actually proves that link turn, because when you read it, it says that, quote, 9th Circuit decision that focused on fair use was good. None of these prove that they're tenuous now, just that increasing fair use says zero. Third, extend our 2EC Rube card copyright, at least in new tech, it has inherent flexibility. Fair use is a case-by-case basis. We're going to use and maintain a card as more link defense. It says, quote, copyright has been used to trigger the link, and it says that copy wars have been happening before. They say we changed the interpretation of fair use. Wrong. The second factor already exists. The plan just mandates its use in decisions, and they have no cards about this. It's just an assertion. Oracle thumbs. The thumbers are killer. Extend thimble. We've been copywriting since the 60s, and there's been mutual effects between copyright and software. Second is Google v. Oracle, which thumbs are link evidence itself. Examine the second factor, just like the plan. They say link magnitude. That was above. They say small disputes. That was also above. No turns case because that relies on them winning the link.
Do you want a card doc?
Yeah.
Wait, no, I didn't. That doesn't have to be recorded.
Oh,
But put in the read highlights. I read all
yeah. Avocado. Thank you.